have one final panel before you have 2 hours to just chat and connect, check out the expo hall. So without too much more ado, I'm going to introduce our panel. And on our panel, I'm going to start with Yolanda. She is the founder of Revere XR. She's a trailblazer in immersive storytelling. If you were in her session, it was fantastic. And she brings history to life in transformative ways. She was recognized as a top 100 woman of the future and finalist for the I cannot speak today, Black Ambition Award. Yolanda captivates audiences and with her innovative approach in merging past and future with XR. Next to her, actually on the end in a different order than I have here, she's an innovation and technology support coordinator, I believe in Kent School District. No,
Peninsula
School District. This is when I go off in my notes. Should stay with the notes. But she is excellent at empowering her students and educators to use technology. With over a decade in education, she's led impactful projects with digital learning, custom Minecraft worlds, robotics, and coding to create inclusive and tech-driven learning environments. Not next to her, Megan. Wave. Megan's there. She's an instructional technology integration specialist and supports educators using technology. She also is an expert at using Minecraft education, and she's been doing initiatives with cyber safety and SEL, as well as digital citizenship to prepare her students to navigate and be successful in our digital world. And next to her, to the left, is Rahul. He is a product designer who founded Stat Rookie, which is a phenomenal group. He has created games that teach financial literacy through sports, which he did through the Sharks, and he's currently working on a board game that you should ask him about. And he has a background in aerospace engineering and now spends time creating games for K-12. He also helps host the Seattle EdTech Meetup, so if you enjoy sessions like this, you can find him there and a couple other on the panel as well there. And with that, we have our wonderful panelist. And I'm going to actually let you introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. Yes. Hi. My name is Lyla Ross. I'm a clinical social worker by trade, but I'm also a part of the games industry because I happen to be married to the owner of Mox Boarding House and Card Kingdom. So we have a lot of gaming happening in our household. And I run a nonprofit called Gamers Engaged. Our goal is to increase philanthropy across the games industry through social impact. There are many ways that you can make a difference, and that's not only in money. You can do that in time, treasure, and talent. That's why I'm so excited to be here hosting this panel. Thank you, everybody. I'm very interested in how I'm going to start it off with a general question because we all know we're here for the colliding of education and games. So I'd like to know a little bit about how have you seen the intersection of games and education in your specific work?
I guess I can start. I think for me, it actually started probably 15 years ago because I taught math and I wanted to find ways for students to engage with it and think and have fun. And gaming was that kind of a way, right? Because it was something that kids were interested in, even if it was just as simple as rolling dice to come up with numbers and then do math problems to talk about operations. They didn't want to leave when the bell rang. And so it was from there that those ideas then stemmed out and grew and blossomed. And so finding those sorts of avenues to bring the games in to really encourage creativity, thinking, and excitement.
Great. So I guess when I started Stat Rookie, my mission was to bring an experience of STEM to students without them having any exposure to STEM. So, you look at current STEM games that are out there right now, how do you introduce something without introducing it, which is the problem that we all have sometimes. So I looked at other things that have STEM around us, and sports is very ubiquitous, and I just kind of went down that path. That's kind of how I molded education games together.
Great. jumping on that line, I think I was working in a library role when I first kind of got into bringing game-based learning into that space. So how do I pull together the literacy components and the STEM and the science components? I did a lot of, I was a teacher librarian technology integration specialist. So it was like, got to teach research, but I also have to teach coding. So like, why don't we do some research projects with code involved? Or how do we bring in some of those extra pieces where we can integrate both subjects? And I think that led me on a pathway to being able to bring in larger programs like Minecraft or some of the other gaming platforms that are out there. I know I'm working with like Transfer VR right now, which is a VR-based career training tool, so you can go through OSHA compliance through VR, and it doesn't actually teach you how to turn a wrench, but you know the processes, and so then that allows you to then be ready for the testing and be ready for actually having that time, because not every kid can be on a car at the same time and on a body. So if they can prep, so some of those types of opportunities where we see solutions to funneling problems with students really drew me to using games to offer those alternative avenues.
I can just say briefly, we focused on education for a very different reason. Revere XR was more about preserving history because it's disappearing, because it's being paved over. So we weren't so much focused on the gaming component at all. We were trying to initially open up VR, AR, and AI to really focus on education, to provide a connection to the past and to past legacies and icons. And we're learning now, because the majority of the public uses this technology in a gamified way, and especially if we're going to give it to students, we want to make it fun, but we also, more importantly, want them to be connected to the history that they come from, and to help teach them how to use the technology and preserving it. So one part really is just the foundation of education, and learning immersive storytelling connects them to humanity, to each other, to stories, to history. But the gamified option allows people to engage in a scavenger hunt, which traditionally just makes it a little more fun.
I'm an A+ on the scavenger hunt. That's my jam. Well, so along those lines, especially as a clinical social worker, this is another area that I'm really interested in is, how do you see the relationship between gameplay mechanics and educational outcomes? Are there certain mechanics that enhance specific skills like critical thinking, problem solving, or collaboration? Those are things that teachers are always hoping to impart. And then what about soft skills development, empathy, communication, and teamwork? That's a mouthful. Take your time. Just I'd love to hear some examples.
Well, I think what's really important to really look at that question is the impact point of what you're trying to design, right? Mm-hmm. So, my personal philosophy is, I think there is a lot of work to be done in the classroom for the teachers, administrators, everyone who's involved in students. So getting additional stuff to teach can sometimes be a challenge. So creating educational experiences, gaming experiences that get students excited about what they're going to be learning in class is a focus that we should really work on. And I think that's where, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. That's where I think that's what, so that's personally like my design philosophy in our product. So that's, what we try to bring to the classroom.
Yeah. So it's not so outcomes driven. It's inherent in the design so that it's kind of meeting both of those pieces. Is that what you're saying?
No, well, I'm trying to say essentially anything that sparks that curiosity for the student to ask that next question inside class is what, as a game designer, what I would like to do. And however I can do that through my games,
I think you keyed on to maybe as you were going was this idea of administration and teachers and their access to that as well. one of the things I am challenged with, right, at the central office of a district is how do I get something that I think is effective or engaging or is game based into the hands of the staff when they may or may not choose to come to an optional professional development. There isn't necessarily a lot of wraparound supports for execution of these things. And teachers by nature, there are many that have a lot of great thoughts on game mechanics, but we're not trained in game mechanics. So I can tell you how to work with a student, but I may not necessarily know how to write a really quality game that's going to engage all of my kids and then be able to be differentiated. And so I'm thinking about that piece is I would agree. I think sometimes the relationship challenge comes into the time and the space and the training around the staff who want to bring these types of things in, but there's those barriers that can get in the way. So it's like, how do we model that in the PD that I even offer? So if I do have at least some come, then could I make their PD game based? I was just researching bingo based, like PD option, like those ideas, like they get a bingo card throughout the whole year. And if they go to so many, there's a prize. And yet we laugh at that. But it can be effective. And if that's effective with the adults, how much more is it with the kids, and how to get them access to those things? I think that's something to keep in mind in that relationship is not everybody knows the difference between the two and how do you merge them together without the time.
I'd say initially our focus was, again, we created something to solve the problem of gentrification and the erasure of history. So our first and foremost outcome was, are we engaging intergenerational communities and making sure there's oral history exchange? And are we kind of giving students the chance to have some ownership in redeveloping through immersive technology specific spaces that house history that's important to them? Are we letting them pick history that's important to them and teaching them how to recreate it? Well, so that's where we started. And then what I can say is where we're at now is providing immersive storytelling certifications. Our outcome is teaching students to be immersive storytellers and to gain traction in an industry where they can make millions before they even go to college. And I think that's going to change a lot for young people. And I think they need it. And I think our priority, while there are a lot of other metrics, is mostly about reinstilling and preserving what's being lost. And we see that providing them emotional intelligence, empathy, social learning, respect for elders. That's not on all schools' lists, but it's on the Yolanda Barton school list.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I was just going to add, I think, like from my standpoint, similar to, I guess, kind of what you were just saying, Yolanda, like a lot of it does come into how are you teaching those critical skills to students through what you're doing in the class, whether it's a traditional lesson or a gamified lesson, so that they are able to cooperate and have hard conversations like, like I do a lot with Minecraft. So, right, you just like spawned into my world and then you like blew up all of the blocks, the house I just, right, or you mined through, and then kids get mad. And so how do you help them to deal with those conflict through having conversations? And that's what I think for me, games have brought in, because I am able to not only connect to the content that there's, you know, supposed to be learning, but also help them build those skills so that when they go out into the workforce, they're able to work with people that maybe they don't like, but they have to work with, because that's often what I hear a lot. I don't like that person. I don't want to be on their team. Well, that's a skill we've got to learn.
That's right.
And so for me, I think that's why I think it's so important to bring it in and use it.
Yeah. And actually, I saw a lot of questions about it happening throughout the day. So we know that games are powerful in that way. Okay. So I would love to learn a little bit more about the intersection of gaming and education as it relates to AI and VR. Do you think that these technologies will revolutionize this space, or, you know, tell me more about that?
I'll just go quickly and say there are a lot of risks and some that we haven't even identified. But if I want to just focus on the positive for a minute, I would say we're really excited about using AI to recreate historic figures so that they can be in the classroom and that students can interview historic figures. So in Atlanta, there's Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King and John Lewis. Like, you can read or have, which you should still read, or you can have a professor or a teacher stand there for 8 hours telling you that history or reading it to you, or you can actually interview the historic figure yourself and learn a lot. So that's what we're looking forward to.
Awesome.
Oh, I love that. And I think that's the opportunity that I see with AI in general is how we can take a lot of the barriers to entry, because things that may have taken a lot more skill is now conversational, right? And because you can talk to the AI in such a simple way, it allows a variety of access points to information. And depending on how you build that model and what information you hang on it, then those students have access to so much more quickly and in a way that is where their mind is processing. One of the things I know I've been working on lately is thinking about how do you build the critical thinking skills still back in, right? And how do you build some of these questioning skills back in? Because we have to be able to verify the information. Yeah. Can't just trust it like it's a search engine, right? Even though we probably shouldn't have ever trusted our search engines. But I had this great conversation with a colleague just last week saying, what was one of the assessment tools that they could use to vet an AI? And I was like, and we kind of came to this conclusion that it was more about the actions you didn't take with the AI than the ones you did. So what things did the AI suggest to you that you said, sorry, no, thank you? Record those as you're going through it, not just all the things that, here's my final product and my final, well, what did you tell it to change? What did you tell it that you didn't like? How did it not have your voice when you were having it help you write? And that piece really stood out as a way to get the students thinking about making sure that they're really checking the resources they've been given. And I think that's something that I see helping revolutionize, maybe not necessarily the gaming space, but I do think having the education space of how do you get those types of conversations started.
Yeah, that's huge. I have a 12 and a 15-year-old. And yeah, sometimes it's what you don't do that is the learning opportunity.
Exactly.
Yeah. So actually, I'd love to know a little bit about, from a game designing perspective, how do you ensure that games are inclusive and accessible to students of all backgrounds and abilities? And you kind of touched on that the barrier to entry goes away with some of those technologies, but I'd love to understand other aspects of that.
Well, I think from a game design perspective, this has probably been spoken quite a few times, is compliance. And compliance accessibility in the education space is very important. So oftentimes game developers don't realize that there are certain regulations and compliances to meet accessibility even before going into a classroom. So, I think understanding those is the first step in creating an accessible product.
So that's interesting because that would require the educational system to be collaborating with the games industry. Isn't that interesting? Cool.
I was just going to say, I think from my perspective, from the education side of things, like, yes, it's important that designers are thinking about how they're making their content or their resources inclusive and accessible. But as a teacher, I often go into it thinking like, one, I have to know what is the game that I'm bringing in and how is that going to impact the students and what does that look like? And then think about where are the areas where a student with, a visual disability might struggle or just really anything, right? And so how am I, we do it a lot with programming too, or coding, like how am I offering opportunities for pair programming, pair coding, working together, giving roles or responsibilities to certain students so that everyone's still included and able to engage and interact and be a part of it, but maybe it's just in a different kind of avenue, but they're all still having the same experience.
I think that speaks to, if I am thinking about this idea of ensuring games, one of the things I know, I've recently changed districts. I was working in a Microsoft shop for a long time, and then I shifted to a Mac and Google shop. And so now we I'm trying to recreate some of the same experiences on a totally different platform, and to be able to interchange platforms, and to be able to we have some school, one of our schools is in an area that's very rural, and they're not going home to internet. They might have like a Starlink type connection that they're allowed to turn on sometimes. But then we have other schools that are like right in the heart on fiber. And so how do you build for those experiences as well? Like, yes, the school is the hub that might give them internet, but that doesn't mean they can complete any of those activities outside of class. So I think some of those types of pieces of how are you thinking about the platform they're on, and then the access to which students or the main completer of the activity has to internet, and some of those pieces too.
You said inclusion, right?
I sure did.
Okay, so that's a TED Talk
Mm-hmm.
in tech and game. So,
Yeah.
but it is a very serious topic.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to pretend like it isn't. And the industry itself doesn't reflect the inclusion that we expect the students and the education to reflect. So that's a hit or miss there. And as a woman of color in tech, I make up 0.2% of people that get support in the industry. So I'm not going to veer us off on a different direction, but I'm not going to not answer the question and apply the foundation of understanding that needs to come to it, which is we have not arrived even in tech or games at an inclusive place. And how many of you work with developers that don't look like you, and programmers and coders? So we really haven't opened up the industry to the inclusion that we're seeking in education either.
Sure. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, I think just to add on, I think that Yolanda, you bring up a really good point. Even when we're designing games for kindergarten through in the elementary school level, developing the right avatars, I think is representation is extremely important. We have a product in the San Jose school districts, and I purposefully went through the demographics of the San Jose school district and looked at all the different cultures and backgrounds to include names that they would see, images that they would see in themselves. So I think that is very important to thank you very much.
Now you can have
to look at when we were talking about inclusivity as well.
And what I hear you saying is that you took the time to do that, and you made an effort to research, and that's an extra step, and that makes a really big difference. Yeah. Okay, so actually we talked about this a little bit, barriers, but I want to be a little bit more specific about this. What are common barriers that prevent a game from being used in a classroom setting? So for example, you find a really great game that you want to use in your class, but there's a barrier to preventing its use. Like you don't have the technology. It takes a long time to learn. Are there any other barriers that?
Well, we're actually offering it more to the classrooms than we are using it for the classroom. What I will say, a barrier that continues to come up is that there seems to be a lot of concerns from schools and educators about which devices should be used. If there's trust with different devices, because they're concerned about obviously their students' information being tracked, and data is a big deal. So we do see most restrictions with that, like what technology, and we're not sure about them. We don't really know that we want our students using that technology. So I do hear a significant amount of that. And technology is allowing us to do a lot more, XR on desktop. So we can kind of focus a little more on AR instead of forcing them to get headsets that they don't want to use.
I would agree with that. I think technology does play a role from the education side. And only from like an idea of if it's only, available on an iPhone, but not all of our kids have iPhones, right? So then you run into the equity issue. I think, and I will only speak for my particular district, a lot of it boils down to privacy and data and whether or not student information is secure and how it's being shared with outside sources. And then also the whether or not they're following I'm going to get it wrong because I always do, but Melissa will correct me. The 50 whatever.
Section 508. So
Thank you,
the
508.
VPAT
for accessibility and right. So making sure like anyone can engage with the product. If it fails one of those two things, our district right away will say, no, you can't use it. And so coming at it from that lens, that makes it sometimes really hard because teachers they don't always understand why they can't use it. They don't see it. They're just like, this looks really cool. And I just learned about it at, X, Y, or Z, and I really want to use it. Well, so.
Oh no, I was, just to take on to that and or filters. So thinking about your filtering, the impact of education filters have to be extremely heavy. And on our devices, on what we provide to students, and our SIPA and our COPA laws, like that 13 years barrier, which is really tricky for middle school, right? Because you get a lot of really great things that you want to bring in, and then you're like, oh, but there's an entire grade level I can't show that to, just because of the way that those rules come into play. So thinking ahead on, if that is your audience, how are you navigating how your game hits? Even Minecraft last year, they're well versed in that particular process, and we still had some filter issues with some of their updates because they use some of their code from the gaming side that trip up our filter. And so thinking about those types of things, now that's a lot to dig in on for any person, but there's probably if you're working with a school system, they would be able to let you know and vet some things out as you're building.
Yeah, I think after you get past all of the points that are brought up, the one thing that as game developers we often forget is that the person who is using the product is not going to be the person who's going to let the product into the classroom, right? So, if, and I've had to learn this the hard way, if a teacher has to spend 2 minutes on dealing with logins, they're not going to do it. And rightfully so. There's not a lot of time in class to get something outside of what you're supposed to teach inside the classroom. So I think as game developers, we can look at things, just simple things, right? Like if you were to make, logins, right? If you make logins simple, make them automated or, generated sight words that kids see. I think that's very important. And again, you have to look at everyone who is going to put that product into the classroom and talk to them. So as a game developer, you need to talk to the admins, you need to talk to the teachers, and even sometimes talking to parents as well, right? Because they might not necessarily use the product, but they're the people who are going to let the product in their students' lives.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm trying to be mindful of the time. How much time? Who? Okay, I think I was going to leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So how about let's just kind of brainstorm a little bit more. How can educators and game developers collaborate more to create more impactful educational experiences?
Shameless plug, they can come to the Seattle EdTech meetups.
Yes.
That's step one.
Great.
I think we're in a really cool shared space. So I think acknowledging that is important for game developers and for educators, that we're all trying to be impactful for our students. And as a game developer, you always think that your product is this amazing thing, right? And just take the step back and look at what you're trying to do as a game developer. How are you being impactful? And speak to the people like educators and teachers and have their opinion as a foundation for your design. That's what I would say.
Great.
I think one thing to think about, particularly if you're a small game startup or you're trying to get into the industry, you're not working with those larger companies that are already connected with school districts, their ability to maybe take the time to get to the educator or the classroom level in their R&D is great. But I think of the smaller studios, and education is data and information and student rich. We are volunteer poor. So there are roles, there are abilities to connect with your local schools, and help first at a teacher level, at a volunteer level, connect with an advisory committee. I mean, in Washington State, our CTEs, all our current technical education, they all have to have advisory committees to like work on their frameworks and to build out their programming. And we're looking for industry partners constantly to fill those, and yet they don't always come and show up. And I think the opportunity to have, if you're very interested in the education field, step away from maybe the work motivator initially and start with some volunteerism, but then you'll build those inroads and those connections, because relationship is capital in public education. So, go ahead.
I don't know that I have too much more to add other than them. And I think just passion wise, I'd say like, how is it really helping youth? And I encourage educators to want to create the representation for the actual classroom so that students feel like they belong in the future of tech. Because if you can't see yourself and you only see one group of people in that space, you don't feel like you belong, or you don't feel like your voice will be valued or that your contribution will be imperative. And I just want to focus on, I want education to focus on working with organizations, amazing ones like the ones that are on this panel today, but also making sure that they're looking at diversity in the organizations that they're working with, and it not just being specifically about the product, but what's the value add. So I think they said everything already.
That's great. Well, you know what? Actually, this is a nice time to just say, I'd like you to have a moment to share any key takeaway that you'd like the audience to have about the power of games and education. And then we'll take it to questions.
Okay. I'm really interested in creating a larger understanding of what it means to have a preservation partnership in this city, to be preserving Seattle's like soul and identity prior to the millions of condos that have popped up. Like, what has taken place? What memories do we need to preserve? And what's been paved over? And how do we bring it back? And how do we work with schools that actually, A, want to do that, give students a sense of ownership in their city and communities and leadership, and use tech to do it? So I see a lot of silos, and I just wish we could all kind of work together a little more, because we can go a lot farther if we did that. And I just think any teachers that are sort of like, I don't know where to begin, I'm hesitant, I'm afraid of the tech, I don't know how my students are going to feel about it, we're happy to just explore and provide demos. And we have content now that has Seattle's history. So we really want to get it in to the school district so students can also start helping to shape how that history is reimagined.
Very nicely said. I think for me, my biggest takeaway or thinking when it comes to games and education is, how is the game creating students who are thinking? Because oftentimes the classroom is a place where they sit and they maybe do a tiny bit of thinking, but oftentimes they're just there and the teacher's the one doing all of the thinking. And so how can we bring in something that encourages thinking amongst our students and also is fun so that kids want to be in the classroom and learning?
Great.
Yeah, everything's been well said. And I think just to add to that point, I think one of the things that we can do as game developers is just think about yourself as a student and what would get you motivated to learn about a certain topic. You know, like if you think about it, it's kind of crazy for me, is like to understand what compound probability was. I understood that very late in life. And I took statistics and it really didn't, sit right with me until I saw it in a basketball game. This is no joke. Understanding if a player is going to get the ball, right? What's the chance of that happening? And then if the player is going to actually make or miss the shot, right? Just breaking things down like that to say, oh, okay, I now understand this. I can visualize it. And I have that aha moment in math class tomorrow. So I think as game developers, if you can visualize that aha moment, that's very important.
Yeah.
Great.
That was a tough act to follow up with. My takeaway, all of this. I think the piece that I so focus on when I keep games in that classroom space, or as I advocate for that in the work that I do, is this idea that it's my role and my goal to provide that authentic opportunity for our students to access their education and really get to see that, get that shot that they all deserve to really succeed. And I think bringing games in allows us to treat them as the human element that we're trying to raise as well. Yes, and I know this can be controversial, and I often gotten strong philosophical debates with a previous employer about this idea of yes, reading is essential.
Yes.
Math is essential, but if you take that off the table, we're humans, right? And for me, it's like the gaming, the culture that comes out of bringing games into the classroom, that play into the classroom, I think is another piece of what we teach. And we need to acknowledge that, because I think that's the part that is burning us out in a lot of ways, is we're being asked to teach that, but we're not given the lens of it. And so if I can take a game that gives me the conduit to teach those human aspects with my students and work through them in a place that they can fail forward and they can try things out and it can go wrong in a safe environment, then it gives them that much better of an opportunity once they're outside of the walls of my classroom. And I think that's a piece that games bring power to me, is that idea of this is a simulation and yet it's a reality that they're going to then take away as they head out beyond the classroom using the reading and the math that we've taught them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Right?
And I'm just going to take a
Thank
moment
you.
from myself to just talk about key takeaway is we haven't even talked about analog games,
Oh,
tabletop
gosh, yes.
gaming. That wasn't even discussed yet. And I just want to do a shout out to the analog world as well, because there's a beautiful crossover of both of those worlds that I do know teach empathy, conflict resolution, turn taking, all of those important ways as well. So don't forget that those can work together. And that's another pathway to building education and through gaming. Thank you, folks, for your time. Let's open it up to questions. Go for it.
So just listening to what you all presented, one of the things when I work with my peers and just attempting to bring gaming into the classroom or stuff is we want to do fun stuff, but we have to get all the teaching done. And so as you look at bringing games into the classroom and gamification into the classroom, how do you look at the standards and stuff so they can go, oh, I'm meeting the standard versus like, oh, I'd love to play Minecraft with my kids, but I have to teach them how to read because that's what my boss requires. And if he wants them to go, well, this is reading time. What are you doing?
So how do games meet those core competencies? Or
What consideration goes into trying to meet those to convince them that it's good?
Yeah, we ran into that talking with a particular school district and heard that same thing from teachers. And so just initially what we focused on was working with the school to have a hackathon so that it's not taking away, right? Or project-based learning, because none of that's taking away from what still needs to be done, which by the way still needs to be reimagined. But that creates more of a celebration of something new that you're introducing to the school. So the hackathon for us makes it so that schools or even students are like, please come back. You know, how can I get involved? How can I do more? We did a hackathon in February and it just exploded. And that is something I think we can partner with schools and do without taking away. We don't want to take away. But yes, a lot more needs to be designed around that.
Yeah, I think talking to game developers who really understand that issue, you know, a lot of game developers in education will be able to point to standards, right? They'll say, okay, next gen science standards right here, right? This, and this is how you teach it with our game. So I think there are platforms out there to look at games and how they do satisfy those standards. And again, I think it's just a different way of presenting the material, and that's just kind of how you have to look at it.
I'll try to grab the next question on the mic so our live stream can hear it as well.
Someone back there.
I'm running.
Thank you. This is a question for Yolanda and Rahul. You both mentioned some really nice examples of technology use for more equitable and inclusive use cases. Like Yolanda, you mentioned talking to historical figures with AI. And Rahul, you mentioned the San Jose School District. How do we, as designers, address inclusion, but not in a performative way that, oh, we have like 2 brown characters, our game is inclusive. So instead of that, like how else might we address inclusion in the deeper sense?
So I think one thing is that looking at it's important to look at your school district's demographics and authentically adding names that people would see in the cases of avatars. The other thing is in terms of making things accessible and inclusive. For me personally, like I looked at, we were on digital platform before, and I was like, well, not everyone's going to have access to a digital product. So is there another way for me to meet my goal without having a screen in front of somebody? So looking at that question and saying, what resources do people have? And if you can still achieve what you're trying to do, I think that's a way to start.
I just want to ask, was your question specifically about the classroom or was it something else?
Game design in
Okay,
general.
game design in general. I mean, I can say it really gets down to who we are and what we've been exposed to too. Like just because we're grown doesn't mean that we have a solid understanding or contribution or participating in inclusive behavior and practices anyways. Like, so obviously this is a larger challenge than just education. For us, what we spent a significant amount of time doing was going into communities that we know do not have access to technology and launching the question, how do you feel about using virtual and augmented reality and artificial intelligence to preserve history? Now, 90% of the time, as I was saying in my workshop earlier, people are like, in those communities, their response is, what is virtual reality? What is augmented reality? And I'm scared of AI. And so it gives us a chance to work with hesitant tech communities to be able to show them, well, isn't this your history? Aren't you? And then they're able to feel a sense of connection. So it's really trickling down from what we're building. And in our experience, I do hate hearing people say, well, I have 3 people of color and I have this. It's like, it's daunting to hear. But we have to focus on history in a realistic way. And so for us, while we focused on one neighborhood, we want to work on all the neighborhoods, and that will provide the example of inclusion that we need in all of the industries, because we also bring community into our design process to share with us how they feel about what we're building too. So I can say that with Revere XR, the foundation of who we are is inclusion and bringing that to tech. But it's also why we're the oddball too. And I do think that there's a lot of opportunities to continue to explore and grow that. It's just going to take more people.
We are at our 6 o'clock time, so unless someone wants to jump up and demand the microphone, I'm going to let Lyla close out the panel.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, panel. This was a lovely conversation, and honestly, I know we just scratched the surface. These are the opportunities that we need to have in order for collaboration and social impact, and meeting other studios that aspire to feel authentic in their inclusion. And so this is just the beginning of the work. And thank you all for your time.